Welcome to the Being Human UT podcast, where Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigus will discuss issues relative to the humanities and technology at Utah Tech University. And now your hosts for Being Human UT podcast, Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigus.
Welcome to the Being Human Utah Tech podcast. We are at episode 23, and we're very happy to have with us a very special guest. Paul Mozur is a New York Times technology reporter. He is a recent recipient of the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for he and his team's coverage of the pandemic. He writes about technology and politics, and he is based in Taipei right now. So we're very happy to have him with us. And Jim, you've got some things to ask him.
Well, you know, in this podcast, we typically talk about the classroom. We talk about how the humanities impacts the average student. And we are going to talk a lot about your work internationally. But I was just curious, you were double major in English and East Asian Studies, correct? Yep. So how did you land on those majors, and how did that sort of catapult you into the work that you're doing right now?
Yeah, it's funny because I always wanted to be a writer growing up, and I loved reading. And so when I got to college, the idea of being an English major was I already kind of knew I wanted to do that, and was very ambitious, probably overly so, about taking all these courses, reading, big, difficult works like Spencer and Chaucer and so on. And so I was focused on that, but the idea was always to kind of get to the point where I became a good writer. And then the East Asian Studies part is actually quite funny because, we had distrib requirements at Dartmouth, where I went to school, where you needed to take different regions around the world, one class of each. So I think it was like Europe, North America, East Asia, maybe something like that, and probably like Africa, Middle East. And so I took a East Asian art history course my freshman winter, and it was like a Monuments of East Asian Art History. And we kind of went around the region and studied, Indian temples and Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and the kind of ink mountain paintings of China and Japan. And I was just so blown away by it all that I just started taking other East Asian art history courses, and that led to taking Asian history courses. And by the time I was a junior, I decided I wanted to go to China and try and learn some Chinese. And that was a sort of incredible experience that really opened my mind to, at the time was an incredibly dynamic place. And I kind of never looked back from there. I just sort of totally embraced it. So it was actually the beauty of the distrib requirement that got me kind of where into the place I am today.
Well, I know we always talk about as educators that you can never underestimate curiosity. That mm-hmm. People just I think a lot of the modern student, they just think about career and where that career is going to lead them towards. But I mean, it sounds like your curiosity led you towards your career.
Yeah, that's right. And it's funny because I remember basically after graduation, I was looking around for jobs, and all I wanted was anything that would let me write. It was just like, okay, what can I find that will allow me to write? And I didn't have that much kind of hardcore journalism experience. I had worked on a book review periodical, but I wasn't doing that much kind of news writing. And I got a job kind of writing features at a very local paper on an island off of Seattle. And, kind of instantly fell in love because it was like I get to meet weird and interesting people, write about crazy things that are happening. And each time I'm writing, I'm getting better and better. And so then I just kind of fell in love with the discipline. But, I came to journalism after my full formal schooling was finished. Like I haven't gone back to do anything since my undergraduate in terms of education. And my education had not, was not at all focused on journalism, but the skills I got, the analysis, the creative thinking, the writing, all of these things kind of like immediately came to play in journalism and allowed me to kind of just run with it and develop from there.
Well, and how did... go ahead, Ray. Oh, and I was just going to say that, I mean, this is just such a great example of someone who has taken the skills from English and just sort of led it into their excitement pursuing life. And so many English majors have this fear that they're just going to either, be a teacher, which is the worst thing ever, or
definitely
or they're afraid that they're just going to work at a coffee shop, and like all their relatives just think, oh, what are you doing with that English degree? You're not going to go anywhere with life. And so it's so exciting to be able to see, all right, so you take this and you've used it to pursue your career. That's awesome. Randy, what?
No, I was just going to ask, how the technology element came into kind of your focus. It looks like, before you worked for the New York Times, when you're working for the Wall Street Journal and the Far Eastern Economic Review, you were writing about just about anything, kind of similar to what you talked about when you were, off the coast of Seattle. How did technology work its way into your view?
Yeah, and it was kind of random. I was in Taiwan I was working at a newswire at the time, which was, so covering a lot of, very quick hits on markets, on companies, on political news. But my big kind of beat at the time was weapons sales to Taiwan and also politics. And so I was writing those, and frankly, at some point the editors came to me and said, we're happy with what you're doing, but it's not that interesting to our readers because our readers aren't that worried about the, ins and outs of Taiwanese politics. And what really matters in Taiwan is actually the semiconductor industry and, contract manufacturing. At the time, Foxconn was starting to build the first iPhones in China. And so these are the things that are really important, and to me, I was a little bit kind of bummed by that because I was like, well, I want to write about politics. I want to write about weapons. I want to write about things that to me are tangibly important in this world. And while technology it felt kind of like an aside. But I heard them out and I went and I started looking into it and covering it. And as I started covering it, I came to kind of understand that actually these are the building blocks for the future of the world. And if you can understand in a basic level, not necessarily the deepest level in the world, but if you understand how the industries work, how the technologies work, and how they play into the way companies run, then you can understand how they affect geopolitics, how they affect the world. And if you can put all of that together for people, you're going to show them something that was invisible to them initially, and show them how these kind of, basically otherwise invisible gears that make the world work or that are behind political fights and other things, are functioning. And so the kind of thesis within a year of doing that became like, oh my God, this is actually, something like covering the oil industry or something, but actually far more important and far more interesting because it's going to be constantly changing. And if I can understand it all and understand the complexities of it and, explain it to people, then you open up this whole world of coverage that just nobody was doing at the time. And so that was kind of the thesis. And I just sort of followed that. And then, year after year, that thesis bore out more and more, because we went from, things like producing the iPhone and fighting over semiconductors to, again, disinformation, censorship, surveillance, sanctioning Russia to try and control the chips that go into its weapons. I mean, there's just 100 ways to, again, like the talk I gave the other day, to AI finding its way into weapon systems, to ChatGPT, to fights over the chips that make things like ChatGPT work and countries that want access to that. So it just became this kind of path. And once I got on it, it was just, incredibly interesting. And so I just kind of kept following that thesis. And I guess I was kind of fortunate to hit on a pretty good thesis pretty early in my career. But yeah, that's sort of how it went. It was random, but I kind of made the best of it, stayed curious. And, it has been a really fun ride. So.
Yeah, that's as you were answering that question, I thought, I read the article that you co-wrote last week about the Chinese chip manufacturer and how that battle is going on in the way, the U.S. is trying to prevent the best technology from being released, calling it a matter of national security, pressuring other nations like the Netherlands and Japan to kind of be on board with this. And at the end of it, because I knew I was going to be interviewing you, I wrote a little note. I thought of the great Stanley Kubrick film, Dr. Strangelove. Yeah, I said chip gap. Are we going to have a chip gap? That kind of thing has become the focal point of what used to be merely debates about, weapons and armies and politics.
Precisely, and that's exactly where we are right now when it comes to that. I mean, the idea that the most advanced bits of technology need to be controlled because they are the building blocks for making breakthroughs in science and technology and weapons and everything, is basically mainstream in both the United States and China. And so as we see that competition between the two countries, that is kind of where we are. And it does feel very strange Lovian in a way. Hopefully we don't get to the precious fluids and everything else, but yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Well, as I was sitting and listening to your presentation on Wednesday, one of my thoughts, continuing with this theme of moving from the classroom to the world, and I always hate to say the real world because I still exist in the real world, but it also is sort of in this theoretical space. And I'm thinking, okay, I have the luxury as a professor, and students have this luxury of being able to look at sort of frightening aspects of society and the world in a textbook and just having a conversation in an air-conditioned room and everything seems fine. And you are in a space where you are talking to people who are programming machine guns and drones that blow up things. And so how do you, is that exciting or is that terrifying to you that you are actually right there in that space? You're analyzing it, but you're in that space.
Yeah. It's both, like obviously being in a place that's a war zone and, that is always, quite scary, and talking to people who are building this, it can be difficult too, because they have their own traumas and the things that they're building, they're doing to defend, their family members and their friends. So there's a lot that's, pretty heavy, I guess, in terms of, the sort of ways that the emotions and everything is kind of freighted with what you're kind of dealing with. But what I'll say is, going from the classroom to we'll not call it the real world, we'll just say the world. I think the thing to me that was always interesting was that, I read all of these things in books, as I was studying. And I always kind of wondered what it was like. You read something like All Quiet on the Western Front, right? And it's just this tremendous work about war, but you have no idea what it was like to be in World War I, and you don't really have any sense of these things. And oftentimes when I go to these places, I think about the books that I've read and kind of get approximations about what it actually feels like and what it looks like or what it might have been like to be in those scenarios. So, you take the All Quiet on the Western Front example. It is very much a trench warfare in Ukraine, and to be in some of the towns near the fronts where they've been abandoned and guys are just kind of sleeping off the front, dozing for 16 hours at a time, just exhausted after, several months of being, on the front lines. And then you interviewing them as they, come back from that, that feels like a set piece straight out of that novel. And you start to kind of understand what that looks like and what that feels like and how those people are acting in that moment. And so for me, it feels in some ways like it's filling in the second half of the education. Like if the first half of becoming a, smart and well-connected and, interested and engaged human being was to read about all of these things before going out into the world, the second half is to go experience them and live them. And isn't that, why when we come back to books as we get older, we see so much more in them and our appreciation of them changes. And so for me, going out into the world and doing this coverage, it always connects back to that education and feels like it fills it in and enriches it. And I often go back and then reread books that the coverage kind of reminds me of. And it really helps me to not only engage and deepen the kind of ideas of how I think about what's going on, but also process some of it because, it can be difficult to see some of these things as well.
Are you reading anything right now?
Yeah, well, actually, right now I'm reading a fantasy book about a balloonist trying to climb a 200,000-foot mountain. But I'm trying to think what I've read recently that was good. I did read a book, a memoir called Barbarian Days by a New Yorker writer recently as well. That was a fantastic, just kind of, it's a memoir about a surfer. But it goes through, he's a kind of born in the 1950s, and it just walks through each kind of decade, and it, has a take on the 60s, a take on the 70s through this completely different kind of wandering around the world. And it's a really, lovely kind of book. I'm trying to kind of think about writing a bit of a memoir myself at the moment. So I've been reading a lot of that type of work to kind of get a sense. So, yeah.
That's great.
Your talk about writing is interesting, and that does kind of bring us back more into the realm of AI discussion that we often have on this podcast. And you, as a professional writer, what are your opinions about the advent of and the emergence of AI as a writing technology? Jim and I and all of our colleagues, basically, one of the lines that is being taken by many people in academia is, hey, this is something, ChatGPT is something that can serve our students, something that can help our students. And we need to find ways that we can integrate it into our instruction of writing. And, I think a lot of us are exploring those options, but at the same time, it's hard to escape feelings of, threat. Here is this technology that can now do something for our students that if they really want to take a shortcut, they could. So can you talk a little bit about you being a professional writer, you being someone who's really, made your living as being an excellent writer? What are your feelings and attitudes about this technology now that some people are saying, well, in the future, it's going to do all our writing for us?
Yeah, when whenever I'm faced with this question, and it comes up a lot, I refer back to a kind of earlier piece of coverage I did about AI, which was, there's a board game called Go, and it's a very complicated Chinese board game that basically involves black and white pebbles and kind of surrounding your opponent. And it was so complex that, the supercomputers of the 80s and 90s, which were able to solve chess and beat the best chess players in the world, could not beat the best Go players. The human brain was better than the best computer through to the 2000s. But then in the 2010s, a Google-owned company, DeepMind, made an algorithm that was effectively good enough to beat the best Go players. And so, we covered that at the time, and it was kind of a remarkable moment because it was the sort of one of the first moments where we saw that AI had this power that was just, so much more vast than the previous ways we had thought about computing. But as we were doing that, the big thing that we wrote about, the big kind of test piece for Google at the time was, yes, our algorithm beat the best Go player in the world. But there was a second set of matches after that didn't get as much coverage that to me was far more important, which is when you gave the best Go player in the world access to the algorithm and you had him face off against the algorithm, he beat the pants off of the algorithm. So if you can use AI as a tool, as somebody who is also well studied in the topic, and you have access to that algorithm, you're always going to do a better job than the algorithm itself. And there's just no world, when it comes to how AI works, that you don't need a very smart human being who is well studied in the topic they're using the algorithm for. There's no world in which that person won't do a better job than just an algorithm on its own. You know what I mean? To me, AI is super exciting because it just makes us much better at what we're already doing. But you have to be good at it to begin with, and you have to form those core competencies. You can't make AI write a really powerful, persuasive essay if you have no idea what a good, powerful, persuasive essay should sound like, if you can't go in and just sort of meddle with it and think through your ideas. If you can, and then you have AI, it'll make your paper that much better. And I just feel like going forward in the future, it's going to be interesting because I feel very lucky, actually, because I was able to develop all these skills at a time when there wasn't an easy way out. And so for younger students, I the only thing I can say to them is, really work hard on these old skills that look like they're, dated, because what you will develop from it is not so much the ability to write, but it's the ability to think. It's creative analytics. It's synthetic reasoning. It's these sort of very core concepts that make you a smart person, an engaged person, and it will allow you to use these tools in ways that other people won't, and that will set you apart, And so to me, that's how I think about the topic. And so it doesn't worry me that much. I'm actually quite excited by AI because it just feels like there's so many different ways that we can use it, where it can save time, it can make us better, it can make us more productive, if you're smart and you embrace the technology and you know how to use it.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right.
Well, I think that, and I think you hit upon one of the core struggles that I think we have, is it just convincing the student that it is valuable to be an expert in this, or at least put in that hard work to be the expert, to recognize what solid writing is, what solid critical thinking is. And I mean, you encounter, I think all of us who came around before AI, we know that if AI was around when we were students, there was that temptation of like, oh, not putting in the hard work sounds like a good idea. Right. We've all written probably papers past midnight and gone, if I could have just plugged in a prompt and this just churned it out, I could have gone to bed. And so it's that, spelling that idea of putting in that work and seeing the value of that work. And, it's just another challenge, which I don't think I faced as a student. I did. And I think all of us here didn't face that as a student of just saying, well, there was a really clear, easy way out.
Yeah.
We had no easy way out.
And I actually, it's funny because when you think about that, I found sometimes you learn about yourself too in the way that you're forced to work. And so I was thinking of a paper I wrote where I think I had a date to a sorority dance. And so I went out to the dance and I hadn't done the paper. And so I got home at like 1 a.m. and the paper was due at like 7 a.m. And so I just stayed up all night and in 6 hours banged out like a 5-page paper. I think it was on Beowulf. And the paper was like awesome. Like it like got an A. I like nailed it. The professor was like, this is just fantastic stuff. And I couldn't believe, I was like, well, because I would sit in the library for days agonizing over my papers and then turn out something like mealy mouth that wasn't very good. And so the kind of power of the deadline and the power of pressure and the need to just kind of go with your instinct. And, it was, in that moment was something that like, that I learned. And then I started kind of doing that more where I'd give myself deadlines to trigger myself to get something out and then come back to it later and work on it instead of, and so I learned how to work in a way by, in some ways procrastinating and having to deal with these deadlines. But I'm almost certain if I were in that same position now as a 20-year-old, I would get home at 1 a.m. and just be like, well, I'll chat GPT this one and the next one I'll work hard on, So I don't know how you get around that. And in some ways, I feel lucky as an older person because I have those skills and I develop them. And all the young people, I'm going to be more competitive then. So, in a job marketplace, a little bit, it feels like, an advantage. But I mean, I think that is something that, students should bear in mind,
Well, and I mean, one of the things you just said right there, which is kind of exciting that you identified as a student, was that you felt an enjoyment or like the deadline spurred you on. So it's not a surprise that you landed in this particular career.
Yeah. It's the right. Yeah. Probably the right job for me. Yeah. It's true.
I mean, we'd like to highlight with students is, you have this discovery space in the university where you kind of figure things out about yourself, and they're not always about like picking your major. It's about identifying, is this what drives you? Is this how you like to operate? I always kind of tell students, one of the tired things that I say to them is that, don't go into health sciences if you don't like blood,
right.
Because if you're drawn into something that you think is going to be, either exciting or lucrative financially, but it's not who you are as a person. That's the stuff you figure out in the university.
Yeah. And I feel like it's funny because that point also is something that it may take 20 years to figure out after university that you've gone awry on. And I do feel like, journalism is not the most profitable industry in the world. And, there were many, many years out of school where I kind of questioned whether I had chosen the right path because I was working my tail off and not making a lot of money. But, once you kind of burst through into middle age, you look around and you realize a lot of people who are making money are just absolutely miserable with their lives. And if you wake up every day and enjoy what you're going to do, even if you're not making as much money, that is just a very precious thing. And it's something that I think you really kind of have to live through to kind of get to that point where you realize that. But it's an important lesson.
Well, I don't want to be, end things on a negative note, but if we go back to the realm of the serious, what do you see as the future of AI and weapons technology with all the innovations that are going on in places like Ukraine, with all of the advancements that are happening with weapons systems? What's the trajectory that you see going forward?
I think what I think is really important is that a lot of people just don't even realize that the genie is already out of the bottle with a lot of this stuff. We kind of focus in our day-to-day life on things like ChatGPT and the sort of tech products that are around us. But the main takeaway, I guess, I want people to have is just that, the weapon systems that are using AI in very powerful ways are already here. They're being used on the battlefield now. They're being tested and they're being improved. The idea of a drone swarm that can optically track humans that costs very little money is just absolutely around the corner. Probably within the year, we'll see something effective doing that. And so at that point, you have a low-cost technology, a consumer technology effectively that can be bought at a Best Buy, that's powered by AI algorithms, which come from a lot of computing, but can ultimately be put out on the internet and downloaded and aren't that large in terms of the file size. And so we'll see the spread of that, and there's not really I don't think there's really a way to go back from here. And, we will have to think about regulating and we'll have to think about protecting people from these things. But at the end of the day, we are only going to see further sophistication. The drone is at this point, the new asymmetric weapon of our age. And we're just beginning to see the applications of that. And so, going forward 5-10 years, especially if wars like the one in Ukraine continue and that innovation pushes forward, we're going to see some very scary sci-fi things that are out of Black Mirror and all the rest. And it's really almost already here. And so, I would just encourage people to kind of think about that and think about, where they stand on that. And also the fact that, look around the technologies that you hold in your hand and you can buy at your local store or online today, because those things have more computing power than, the rockets that went to the moon 50 years ago. And so there's a lot that you can do with that, and AI makes it even more capable. And so I just think we're kind of at another moment where we're going to have, there's going to be a lot more wonder and gee whizness, I guess, about breakthroughs in the coming years. And I just, encourage people to be ready for that and to understand that it's important to understand how this stuff works, where it comes from, and to be ready for, a lot of shifts in how we live because of that.
One of the more frightening aspects I thought was about this topic that you brought up in the beginning was just how pervasive it already is, in the sense that it's not just that there are drones that can, bomb people, but it's the fact that cameras are everywhere and they've been there for so long. It's not like this is a new invention. I remember the first time I went to London and I saw all the cameras everywhere, and that was in the early 2000s. And I'm like, well, this is
right.
It's almost literally like 1984. And,
right.
and so it's been, it's just something that I think people have this cognitive, or they just ignore, that it's so pervasive, and they ignore the fact that their phone is always probably listening to them, and they're always, and so that's the frightening thing, is that when these things become real, when you hear bombs in the background and you know that a robot set off that bomb, that's when it's like, okay, I can't ignore this anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, I do wish to some degree that people were more aware in particular of privacy, because the privacy that's lost with things like, the various facial recognitions that are on our phones and the ways that we, carry around our phones and broadcast where we are all the time. When you're in a critical situation, for instance, in Hong Kong, when we saw the kind of democracy protests in 2019, being able to protest without having your identity immediately recognized and then broadcast out, and having your family harassed and you attacked, became a core part of democracy. So when we have such sophistication that, you can point a camera at somebody and identify who they are, that takes away from democracy in a way, anonymity, and the ability to carry out civil action, in a peaceful way without being immediately identified and then politically persecuted, is, I think, a basic right that we haven't really thought of as a right, because the technology wasn't there to make it not something even, kind of significant or something that we would even think about. And now all of a sudden we've crossed that river, we're on the other side of this Rubicon, where all of a sudden everybody's identifiable at any given moment. And, nobody really chose to get there. Nobody said, oh, we're here. It's just the technology developed and all of a sudden we're on the other side. And what that means for our democracy and what that means for, critical political moments is huge. And I don't think in the United States we've really had to worry about that as much as some of these other authoritarian contexts. But, you do see it in terms of trolling and doxing people and things like that. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as well. So, I mean, it is a thing that, you can't fully stop it and people adjust to it, but it's important to step back and think of how the technology has changed the fundamental inputs to a functioning democracy and civil society and so on.
Yeah, that gives us a lot to think about. And I like this idea of putting a lot of the responsibility back on us and how we use technology even in our everyday lives. We're not the people making a lot of the huge decisions about a lot of the topics we've talked about, but we have technology in our lives to such a large extent. Did you have anything else, Jim?
Oh, I mean, I have so many. I mean, working off of that idea, I guess, we got to wrap this up at some point. But I guess one of my other thoughts when I was sitting in that classroom, or it was actually in that Zion room space with listening to your presentation, was that, yeah, I mean, there is that degree of safety that, I don't, I can look at the distance of somebody who is in a trench programming and, a machine gun, programming a drone. And I can be like, all right, well, that's great. I'm going to go hop in my car and drive home and everything's fine. I don't see anything. And so, I mean, as someone who's gone to these spaces, gone out internationally and seen war zones, which, I'm sitting here in Utah, I don't see a whole lot of war zones happening on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. What do you say to just the average American who, is able to shut out this sort of reality and shut out also, and kind of like we're saying, shut out that technology to say, well, the worst thing I have to worry about is that, like I might be looking at some kind of, AI generated political ad. And that's the biggest danger I'm experiencing. How do you talk to someone when you've seen things?
Yeah, what I would say is, and it's not just like war; it's also these authoritarian contexts. In a place like China or Myanmar, or Russia or elsewhere, where you see that this technology is basically weaponized against the people in a much more powerful way. And what I would, the only thing I say to people, and again, it's hard because such are humans that they don't really take these things seriously until they're confronted with something more existential as a crisis. But, I say, like, just think of how lucky you are to have the democracy you have and, the peace you have. And the things that assure that is your participation, your care, your willingness to be a part of it, to think through it and to express your ideas and your desires for how these technologies are going to be developed forward. And you're lucky because you have more power than almost anybody else in the world to control these outcomes. And so make sure you wield that power. Don't just kind of, turn a blind eye and swipe to the next, TikTok meme. Actually take time and think about what you're doing and why, and try to be an engaged part of your democracy to, push for the right controls of this stuff, because it is coming for you and it is powerful, and it's not going to, the technology is not going to stop. And a lot of what we see in China in terms of surveillance, what we see in Ukraine and Russia in terms of these weapons, they will come to the United States at some point. These dark sides of technology are very easy to do, and they're going to change your world. And so you should heed the warning signs. And, not everybody will, obviously, but it's very much worth thinking about. And it is hard to get people to think about it. But the whole entire point of my job, I guess, is to at least try to be, a voice warning about some of these things. So I hope some people listen and kind of pay attention.
Hope so too.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you. We've just been talking to New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Paul Mozur, and listening to his insights on some very, very important ideas. Please join us next time for the Being Human Utah Tech podcast, and we will talk to you later.
Thanks, guys.
This has been the Being Human UT podcast with Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigas. Please follow and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. From Utah Tech University, this is the Being Human UT podcast.